And speaking of security, it certainly is my honor to announce the next keynote speaker. This gentleman is comes to us by way of. By the way, I'm going to hide behind my video here because it was a little choppy there. So I'm going to stay behind that for the time being. But Mr. Grant Schneider, Senior Director of Cybersecurity Services at Venable. Prior to that, he was the Federal Cyber Information Security Officer for I think 2+ years. Was the deputy. Prior to that, did a bunch of roles, advisory, etc., policy at the National Security Council, and was actually the advisor to the director of OMB. What is really important to point out about Grant is he could only do those jobs as well as he did because he earned his stripes and got his chops with 21 years over at the Defense Intelligence Agency with a variety of roles: policy, budget, resource management, and of course, ultimately the CIO over there for 7 years. He's going to talk to us about 5G, a super important technology that is going to sort of explode onto the market, and supply chain, and perhaps supply chain inside of 5G, but supply chain overall. Grant, over to you.
Thanks, Luke. I appreciate it. Can you hear me okay?
Can hear you, and we like that whole COVID look you got going on there, Grant. That's
you know, I mean, we all have to try these things. So,
yes.
No, thanks, Luke. Really appreciate it, and thank you, Bill, as well. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk some about supply chain and to take some questions. So I know we're going to do some Q&A at the end. So if you've got questions, please feel free to send those in the chat room, and we can have this be a little bit more of a dialogue. But I do want to touch on a couple topics. As Luke mentioned, I'm recently out of government, so he did mention I'm at Venable, which is a law firm. I'm not a lawyer, not becoming a lawyer. However, we do have a cyber practice there that I'm really excited to be a part of and be able to hopefully continue to influence in some of the spaces that I've been able to for the last few years, which, as Luke noted, I kind of bounced around the executive office of the president for the last 6 years, kind of to some degree doing the same work from a number of different perches. But was able to see, you know, our policy and our strategy development, both from a national security standpoint and from a federal cybersecurity standpoint, which are interrelated as well with our economic security. And I want to talk about a couple things. I want to talk about 5G. The administration put out a strategy on the strategy to secure 5G earlier this year. It's a relatively lightweight document. It's worth the read. It's literally only 5 or 6 pages. And so it's very high level and kind of talks to what are the tenets that the administration is thinking about around 5G. And then I want to talk some about supply chain in general, what's happening in the government, and particularly around some work that the Federal Acquisition Security Council has been doing. I was the chair of the FASC, the Federal Acquisition Security Council, right before I left government, and they've got, you know, I think we got to a good point of some things that need to move forward, and I'll sort of talk about the charge of the FASC and where I think at least I left them at, and some of the opportunities going forward. The 5G strategy, just to hit on, if you take a look at it, again, it's pretty high level, and it's really about some guiding principles. And guiding principles, government and the administration, as we look at 5G. I think 5G has become one of the, you know, really a quintessential technology that has had broad policy impacts and influence, you know, on the administration over the last few years. And I think it has been, you know, an example and an exemplar of a number of different policy areas, and really focused a lot of folks in the White House or in the West Wing's attention on technology that may not otherwise be as focused on it. And it's because of the far-reaching impacts that we know this infrastructure is going to have on us, on our personal lives, on our professional lives, and on our national and economic security. And so the 4 lines of effort, the first one is about the domestic rollout. So how do we ensure that Americans are going to be able to benefit from the capabilities that exist in 5G and be able to basically get those capabilities across our country and get it. You know, we have geographically a big country. We have heavily densely populated places, and then we have some sparsely populated, and we want that capability to be available to all Americans wherever they happen to be. So that is a huge lift. It might be an easier lift in some of the more densely populated places, but it's a significant lift and significantly important in the rural parts of the country as well. So how do we ensure that we've got that capability out there? Secondly is assessing the risks and identifying some core security principles around 5G. And this is, you know, working with industry and identifying, you know, what are some of those key tenets that we want our 5G infrastructure to have, and that we want to be sure that 5G is delivering and delivering on. The third line of effort is assessing the various risks of the technology to the U.S. from a national security and an economic security standpoint. And this starts to get into some of the supply chain concerns, and is part of where the Venn diagram between 5G and supply chain really have significant overlap. Because this gets into, you know, what is it going to look like when, you know, U.S. government entities are operating overseas or operating in another country and having to operate on that country's 5G environment. What is that going to look like? What are the impacts going to be? What are the potential security risks to the U.S., whether it be a diplomatic platform, a military platform, a U.S. company who is operating again on someone else's infrastructure, and are there inherent risks or vulnerabilities associated with that infrastructure, either through the technology itself, you know, a technology vulnerability. Bill just talked a lot about software security in various places, so something along those lines, as well as, you know, a vulnerability, or not a vulnerability, but a risk due to the nation state host and the technology that was developed by a particular nation state, and the laws of that particular country that may enable you know, more malicious activity or malicious, in our minds, access to our data and information. And then additionally, the economic security. 5G is going to be a huge economic growth area, and not just in the area of, and this is something that I think people don't always think about, not just in the area of, you know, developing 5G hardware and deploying the hardware and building out the infrastructure. That is a piece of it, but it's really going to be the smaller piece, in my opinion. The broader economic part is the capabilities that 5G is going to deliver. It's really going to enhance the concepts of autonomous vehicles, and the fact that you're going to have, you know, broadband type network speeds at your device all the time. And the amount of innovation that's going to open up is going to be amazing. And we don't know what it's going to look like, but we know that people are going to innovate to leverage these technologies and leverage these capabilities. And that innovation is going to be a huge economic boon. And part of the domestic rollout, the criticality of the domestic rollout is tied to this economic security, to be sure that innovators want to come to, you know, America and come to the US and be able to innovate here, and be able to innovate and keep those innovation opportunities and some of that economic growth out of the innovation, you know, here inside of our economy. This line of effort also does talk about the Federal Acquisition Security Council. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a bit, but it starts to talk about the supply chain risks inherent as well. And then the fourth line of effort is about promoting responsible deployment globally of 5G capabilities. And so this is really about getting with our, and I think we have an open mic someplace, but this is really about working with like-minded countries, working with our partners to have some core and key cybersecurity principles. And we have the Prague principles that are out there that are kind of a starting point along this, but it's working either bilaterally with countries, multilaterally with countries. And this line of effort also starts to introduce, I think, a really important concept, and one that we don't talk enough about, in my opinion, around supply chain. And it's the concept of a set of trusted suppliers. A lot of supply chain, we end up talking about what not to buy, what's risky about it, what are the vulnerabilities, why shouldn't you do that? Having blacklists, if you will, and I think we really need more focus on how do we get supply chain security in the front end, right? How do we not have that be too many negatives, excuse me. How do we ensure that we are building supply chain security and on the development of tools and capabilities, whether they're software tools and capabilities, whether they're hardware tools and capabilities, but that is something upfront, as opposed to just being something that is thought about at the end and assessed at the end. And right now we have a lot of products and services that are in the marketplace, and supply chain might not have been, it was taken into consideration to some degree by the developers and the manufacturers, but I don't think there was transparency around it, right? We don't, as consumers of the products, whether you're the federal government or a company or an individual, you don't know what that looked like because it just wasn't something broadly talked about. And so we have to find ways to do those assessments. But this line of effort in the 5G strategy really talks about how do we ensure that we're growing capabilities to develop the 5G in a trusted manner. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean inside the US or domestic, it means inside of our like-minded partners out there as well. So how do we have that trusted supply chain that we can all go to? So I probably spent almost as much time talking about the National 5G strategy as you could spend reading it. Again, it is a broad directional framework to be a bit of a unifying document, I think, for the administration inside of government as well as outside of government, to have some consistency of here's what we mean when we talk about 5G and the security aspects of 5G. So it's going to be a continuing growth area, a continuing importance area, again, for national security, as well as for economic security going forward. So I also want to talk about some of the other efforts. I'm going to drill in on the Federal Acquisition Security Council, as I mentioned. However, I think you are all aware there's a lot of different supply chain initiatives that have come out either of legislation or executive actions over the last 3 years. DoD, you had a panel this morning about CMMC. So DoD is very focused on CMMC, which is an assessment of a company or an organization and what the practices they have in place. We've had executive orders around the supply chain EO, which looks at telecommunications equipment in our commercial environment. So what is it that our big telecommunications providers are putting into our nation? We've had an executive order around the bulk security of bulk power supply for the equipment that the government is buying, because the government owns some equipment around bulk power supply. And then we've had and a couple other EOs, but we've also had legislation. And so some of the legislation was the Secure Technologies Act, which is focused on the security of equipment that is going to be used inside the federal government. And so be it within the Defense Department, within the intelligence community, or within the federal civilian agencies. And so the Secure Technologies Act created the Federal Acquisition Security Council It's housed inside of the Office of Management Budget, and has a chairperson that the director selects from a senior person inside of OMB. As I said, I was the first chair of that for the last year and a half or so as the council has existed. And the council is charged to do a couple things. One, to look at information sharing and how is information sharing, supply chain information, going to be shared both internal to the government, across government agencies, as well as with private industry, and what type of information can and should be shared, how is that going to be shared. The council was tasked to identify an executive agent for information sharing. We did that. It's the Department of Homeland Security, CISA. And it's important to note that while CISA is the executive agent for information sharing, they're not the holder of the information. And the council was very clear that it is more of an administrative role than CISA is going to hold all the information and decide who gets to see it and how it gets shared. They're going to facilitate that work on behalf of the council in general. And so that's been an important area. Another task that the FASC had is to look into shared services. Not every organization or every agency is able or has the same resources to do supply chain assessments. So what are the opportunities for shared services in that space? And then one of the bigger areas, or potentially more impactful areas, is that the council is charged with recommending removal or exclusion orders to the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, or the Secretary of Homeland Security. And those three individuals are granted the authorization in the legislation. And this is the part actually that really required legislation. Some of the other aspects could have been done with executive action, but those three individuals are authorized to issue removal or exclusion orders for their segment of the enterprise. So Secretary of Defense for DoD, the DNI for intelligence systems, and the Secretary of Homeland Security for the rest of the federal civilian agencies. And they can issue removal and exclusion orders that are exactly what they sound like. This product or service or company poses an unacceptable risk to the enterprise, and therefore can't be purchased or needs to be taken out of the environment. And those assessments, the recommendations will come out of the council. So the council, which is represented by the Department of Justice, and FBI, the Department of Defense and NSA, Department of Homeland Security and CISA, Department of Commerce and National Institute of Standards and Technology, the General Services Administration, and the Office of Management and Budget. I think I hit them all, hopefully. And the DNI, Director of National Intelligence, to include the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. And so the council does assessments and will then make those recommendations. And a lot of the work that the council did in the last year was really figuring out how those assessments would be done. What are the types of criteria that would be put in place? Because a requirement of the legislation was to put out a regulatory rule. And so in September, a month ago, the FASC put out an interim final rule that is in place. So it is active. They are soliciting feedback and comments on that interim final rule. But the rule basically establishes that framework and the procedure set of how the council is going to operate. And so now the council needs to go through the process, identify some products or some services or potentially covered entities, and then do those assessments and walk through that process of what a removal and exclusion order recommendation would look like. And so I think that, one of the things that when I was in government, and I still think now, was excited about with the FASC is it is a very systemic approach and hopefully an enduring approach to how to assess risk of a particular covered entity. I think one of the challenges we have and industry is going to have is that other entities in the government are doing potentially similar or slightly different assessments. How are those aligned? What do they start to look like together? And what is that landscape going to look like? And then I think that's a place where, providing comments in, whether it's on the CMMC rule that has gone out, whenever the supply chain rule comes out of Commerce on the Federal Acquisition Security Council rule, all of those, I mean, they're being developed somewhat in conjunction with each other, but also I would candidly say somewhat independently, just by the nature of the beast. And so, you know, providing thoughts and inputs on that is going to be really, really important. So a little bit of the waterfront of what I think the environment looks like right now. I will also add, I think there's going to be more of this. There's going to be more supply chain legislation. And I didn't even mention, we obviously have Section 889 from the National Defense Authorization Act about, you know, particular companies that the government can't do business with. And the rule that came out that also flows that into companies not doing business. If a company does business with one of those covered entities, they can't do business with the government. I think we're going to continue to see more legislation in this space going forward, regardless of what happens in the election in November. This supply chain risk management is so impactful to our overall security. It's going to continue to be in place, and importantly so. It is part of everyone's risk management, and I think should be part of everyone's risk management assessments to understand, you know, what are the risks you're bringing to the table because of your supply chain, and what are the risks that that you're accepting or adopting or inheriting based on the supply chain of your trusted partners and suppliers. I don't think it's just about business to government. I think it's also about business to business, and ultimately to business to consumer as well, although it may be a little less clear to consumers. So this is an area, it's really important. It's going to continue to grow, and it is here to stay. Luke, happy to take some questions or talk through some questions that you have or have come from the chat room.
Definitely have some questions here, and thank you very much. That was some meaty insight there in regards to those two subjects. I know we have a couple of polls as well. We can't take the policymaker out of you, Grant. There's been a couple of polls that you've provided, and we're going to ask as we tee up these questions that we throw the first poll out there. Tracy, do you have that?
Yep, here we go.
All right, how concerned is your organization with their own supply chain? Very concerned, somewhat concerned, not concerned, or focused on it. I can almost bet the predominant answer there, but I'll leave it up to the audience based on your discussion. Let's rewind, start with 5G. I think folks don't realize, I shouldn't say that, and perhaps some of the folks don't realize, 5G isn't just sort of a widget technology, if you will. It's a constellation of technologies that are sort of fused together, right? You know, high density type of antennas, et cetera, different frequencies that make up that technology that, quite frankly, is just going to explode onto the market, as you've talked about. And the consumers and the industrial base at large, not just the defense industrial base, are just
Tracy, we lost Luke.
Yep. Am I back?
Oh, you're back. You're back.
Okay. Anyway, any concern about sort of that mad dash to adopt that technology and making sure that all of these security elements, including sort of the whole supply chain play that you just described there, get incorporated into that capability? Thoughts on that?
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Yeah, sorry about that, Luke, apologies. So you're absolutely right. And this is a place where I think the importance of 5G really can't be underestimated. And, you know, so many of the capabilities that we take for granted today, I mean, quite frankly, the smartphone that we all carry around, you know, were it not for enhanced telecommunications and 3G and 4G capabilities, they wouldn't exist, right? And it's not just that the smartphones wouldn't exist, but all the apps that are on those, all, again, the innovation that was created through those capabilities wouldn't exist. All the economic growth that was created through those innovations would also not exist. And 5G is just going to kind of take that to the next step forward, and really be something that is, you know, furthering the whole idea of kind of Internet of Things and everything becoming connected, right? It is the ability to have those capabilities and put them in place, and the ability to be able to do that, both from a government standpoint, obviously, and an industry and professional standpoint, but also the fact that that is our personal lives as well. And we've seen that this year, right, in the pandemic, where our personal, the way we work in or behave in our personal lives and our professional lives have become one the same of webinars and doing everything on VTC. And quite frankly, 5 years ago, that would have been unheard of, because the amount of equipment you would have needed in your basement and the amount of telecommunications connectivity you would have needed would have just been too high of a bar. And now we carry it all around with us, and we can do that, you know, from anywhere where there's a network connection, which is most places.
No doubt, and again, the explosion of that capability, I'll call it, onto the marketplace is going to be exciting, and also needs to be thoughtfully thought through as far as how it gets adopted. A lot of questions in the chat here about, we're going to jump over to supply chain and your thoughtful comments around that. And perhaps you were on the earlier session when they were talking about CMMC. If you weren't, then I certainly know that you're an expert on that. You know, the FBI, you know, we both know have been at this for some time because of, well, that's what the FBI does, right? But there's a whole bunch of discussion here around, you know, why wouldn't we want to have the industrial base, not the defense industrial base per se, but sort of the commercial supplier industrial base in general, adopt some of these CMMC concepts to address this supply chain issue that you're describing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so one of the questions I got in government a lot was, is the FAST going to adopt CMMC, or is the federal government, civilian government, going to adopt CMMC? And my answer at the time was, you know, I want to see how CMMC evolves and how it progresses going forward. As I mentioned, I think the nature, what I like a lot about the CMMC, and certainly the concept, is that, you know, it is about looking at an organization or an entity and the practices that are in place. And this is where we really have a challenge of, you know, how do I, quote unquote, certify something? And people talk about underwriters laboratories, which of course, you know, tests all our electrical outlets and electronic devices, but our lamps don't change over time. Our electrical outlet, once you install it, it is what it is, and it kind of stays the same. And as we know, our technology devices are always being updated and evolving, being patched and enhanced, which is good. However, it makes it harder to put a stamp on something as a particular point in time, certainly at the device level. And so looking at it from an organization level, I think you start to get into a lot like secure software development. You know, is the company taking into account the right approaches and the right things? And it's a little more like looking at a clean financial audit. Right? A clean financial audit of an organization doesn't say there's no fraud or there's no bad behavior in the organization. It's really about, does the organization have the controls in place to prevent to the maximum extent possible, and then to, you know, identify and detect when that's not possible. And so it starts to kind of tuck into the NIST framework there. But I definitely think that, you know, companies looking at their supply chain and how they present themselves and as a secure provider and manufacturer and developer are going to be really critical. And then how does a consumer, whether it's the federal government or a company or an individual, how are they able to discriminate? And then are they willing to pay more for that more secure product that presumably costs more to produce in some way, shape, or form?
Very good point. It's certainly not one and done. It's especially when you talk about sort of the soft side of things, changing by the minute, by the second, if you will. It's about does that organization, does that entity that's developing that capability have all those controls in place? I love the audit example that you just gave. Let's get the results from the first poll. Yeah, that's doesn't surprise me at all there. Very concerned, as they should be. What's that second poll, Tracy? We'll throw that up real quick and pop one more question out there while we are gathering that up. All right, select one of the following. How concerned is your organization with government oversight and regulation of the supply chain space? Well, that's a nice dicey question. Who came up with that? Oh, shit, Grant himself.
Yes, that was me.
Well, that one's very quickly being answered. Let me ask you, Grant, sitting in the roles that you've sat in, which have been several key ones, and sort of reflecting back, but really looking forward, 2 years down the road, as you turn around and look back at this, what are you expecting to see? Give us your prediction.
Well, I sort of have my what I'm expecting
now, right? You've been unshackled, Grant. Cut loose.
I know, but I'm torn between the expecting to see and hoping to see. To be candid,
I'll let you answer that any way you want.
I think I'm expecting to see more activity in this space. I think when you look at people's risk management assessments and looking at cost and schedule and past performance type risk, we're going to add in supply chain risk as a piece of that, and it's going to be an ever growing part of the puzzle. I'm hoping that as that happens, we're going to see more harmonization around how supply chain assessments are done, that we will see supply chain as becoming a little more of a science than an art. I think there's going to be an art aspect to it because there's a lot of different things, but that we will have a taxonomy around what supply chain means, and because today it means something very different to different people. Some people, you say it, and if you're a defense contractor, supply chain is CMMC. If you're in the telecommunications, it's the supply chain EO, perhaps over at commerce. And so everyone's got a different lens, and I'd like to see their lens, somewhat more consistent. And what I really wanted to ask on this question is, is very concerned, meaning there's too much or too little, or the amount of oversight and regulation needs better harmonization, which is kind of, I think, the camp that I would fall into.
A former Fed, I would say it's probably more concerned about. Well, I guess it could go either way. Who knows? And maybe we'll have Tracy sort of refine that as we go on throughout the day here. Grant, can't thank you enough. You are an absolute patriot. We appreciate all your time in federal service, for everything you did, everything you're doing, and everything you're going to do to keep this country safe. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks, Luke. I appreciate being here today, and thank you all, everyone, for taking the time, and really you guys for helping focus a lens on this really important topic. You guys have a great day.